All right, we're here with Mark Gomez, who's a social studies curriculum specialist in Salinas Unified School District in California. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Mark, when your middle and high school students come into social studies classrooms or other classrooms, what research skills do they already have with them? What kinds of assumptions do they have or skills do they have for searching the internet?
It's a big question. So I think it varies, but by and large, with regards to with just general research skills, I think that a lot of students come in with assumptions about you know the reliability, right, or credibility of information that they find through open web searches. I think they come in not knowing a whole lot about how open web searches work necessarily. So they come in being able to Google, right, that, and turn that into a verb, but not really knowing a lot about what happens on the back end, right? I, I would probably speculate that most teachers also come in with some sense of maybe a higher degree of understanding, but maybe not as much as we would all want to have. There's been little preparation for students with regards to just research as a whole set of skills, of interconnected skills. And I think that's something that I want to expound on later, but with regards to, not just open web kind of Googling things, but also like intense research, right? What does that look like? What does it mean to go to a library or talk to a librarian and help you find the most relevant and trustworthy information that you need to answer a particular question. The last thing I'll say is I wish more students came in with more developed inquiry skills, right? So the ability to ask the types of questions that will get them into the answers that they're looking for, right?
So there are three great things that were packed into that answer. I wish students had more inquiry skills, more practice at asking good questions. I wish they had more training in sort of research as a systemic process. And then they sort of know how to use Google, but they don't really know what happens on the back end.
Yeah, it's almost like they know how to use Google, but they don't know how Google is using them.
That's awesome. Can I ask you that question again? And can you give those same three answers in that reverse order that I just proposed?
Yeah.
That I wish they knew more about inquiry. I wish they knew more about research, and they kind of know how Google works, but they know how to use Google, but they don't know how Google works. They know how to use Google, but they don't know how Google is using them. Could you? Those are all great. Could we just say them again in a shorter order?
Yeah.
So, Mark, what kinds of backgrounds do students have in research and online search? So, Mark, what kind of background do students have in research and online search as they're coming into classrooms across Salinas?
So we're a high school district, 7 through 12, and what we find is that students generally are coming in with not a lot of background. And in particular, one thing that we as teachers would like to see more of is a developed sense of inquiry, right? So students coming in with more strategic and disciplined abilities to ask questions that help them understand information. And we also are struggling to see the types of broad understanding of research as a process, right? And not just Googling things and looking at what comes up in the first 3 hits. And that speaks to the last thing that I think teachers want to see more of, and also themselves want to see how they can better support students in understanding how open web search works, right? So helping students understand why you would want to really think thoughtfully about Googling for something or a question, right? So understanding the back end of how Google works, or search engines in general, right?
So where in the curriculum do you all now introduce the Civic Online Reasoning materials? Is it in 7th grade throughout all the years? Is it in social study classes or other classes?
It's since we participated in the pilot with Stanford, it began in the 10th and 11th grade curriculum for social studies, modern world history and U.S. history, but quickly expanded out once the study was over and the resources were made available, and um, a lot of teachers started to become aware of these materials and want to embed them in their classrooms, right? So anywhere from world language, culture classes to English literature classes. Um, the teacher interest in our district has been phenomenal. We really see a broad spectrum across the board of teachers wanting to implement this type of skills teaching, right?
What are you hearing from teachers about the work they're doing to adapt the materials for an English class or a world language class? Like, how much are teachers using it sort of as is, and how much are they shaping things to their particular curriculum area?
What I see, having led a few professional developments for teachers, especially in the lead up to this opening in the fall in a virtual context. Social studies teachers who have been familiar with this for a little bit longer are more comfortable using the lessons as is, in addition to adapting the lessons to meet different content needs, right? Um, I think teachers who are just being introduced for the first time are hesitant in the sense that it calls to their attention the skills that they also need to develop, right?
There's
So
some teacher learning that needs to happen as the
absolutely,
student learning is happening. We all need to
absolutely,
get better at these skills.
right. And so concepts like lateral reading become easy concepts to understand conceptually, but when applied, like most skills, it requires more time and thought in terms of like building a strategic sequence of experiences that leverage those skills and also allow teachers and students to measure their use of those skills, right? So I think that's where there's some time that needs to be spent, really looking at the different lessons and what you can do with the different lessons, right? And that would allow for teachers to develop their own acumen around these skill sets.
What are the misconceptions that students are coming in with, or what are some of the biggest challenges teachers are running into as they're implementing the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum?
Some things that I've seen, and not just with working within this curriculum, but also just throughout my time being involved in critical media, like literacy education, is the double-sided coin of teacher and student misconceptions. So one big one that I was happy to see uh, the core curriculum address was the credibility of a site like Wikipedia, right? A lot of students come in and into our classrooms and say, well, so and so in the next classroom, doesn't allow us to use Wikipedia as a methods of researching. And we try to explore and get into some of those reasons why. And then there are common kind of misconceptions, right? That anyone can go and edit a wiki site, and so therefore it's not reliable. Um, and so that's one like specific example that we can see being directly addressed by the core curriculum, right? Another misconception that is just as much on the part of teachers as it is for students is this viewing of complex issues and different perspectives being on either one side or another. So very binary type of approach to trying to address quote unquote fake news, right? And so a lot of times we see teachers with good intentions trying to present both sides of an argument, right? And not really looking for the nuance, but also applying this extra, layer of skills that fact checkers employ when it's really talking about the sourcing and where is this information coming from, and why is it coming in this particular fashion, right? So I think teachers and students benefit from practicing these skills in efforts of like really understanding the complexity of a lot of issues, right?
What's an example of an issue where that kind of problem comes up?
I mean, what isn't, right? Take any political debate right now, and I think it's also part of like a culture that we're not immune from. Is that in a hyper partisan culture with a rampant media landscape that is building up that partisanship, it's some teachers feel apprehensive about getting into controversy, right? And so they maybe shield away from more perspectives, right? Or they limit the scope of potential sources in terms of not wanting to be inflammatory in their classrooms, right? And while there's a responsibility that we have to help, the Civic Online Reasoning helps the students' abilities to engage in real civic discussion, right? And civic dialogue, not just civil but civic, right? But that requires a nuanced understanding of a lot of things, right? So you can take something like the current defund movement, the defund the police movement, and there is a long history and deep complexity in a lot of these perspectives that inform not only the movement but also those that are in disagreement with the movement, right? But it's not as simple as like you either get rid of all the police or you keep the status quo, right? And so in a teacher's effort to try and build lessons around an authentic inquiry that might engage students, there's just a lot of work that has to go in, right? So and part of it is just this sheer sense of media available and how overwhelmed even adults feel about like doing that, right? So again, that speaks to that learning curve and the time that it takes to kind of really build something out that you think will help students with those skills.
And then hopefully the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum gives teachers more confidence as they're selecting sources to include, that they know how to evaluate those things, and more confidence that as their students are doing research on these kinds of controversial issues, that they're going to be able to identify how well-grounded different perspectives are and how factual they are and those kinds of things.
Right. I think one of the things that really helps our teachers, in my observation, is the design of that curriculum being based in 3 really important questions, right? And those questions drive everything. And so when teachers kind of internalize asking those questions, and then they can start to adapt to those 3 questions to take a look at different types of media, right? So that you're still asking those same questions when you're looking at a photograph, right? But it takes you in a different path slightly, versus like you're looking at a website, right? The other thing I found is teachers who want to commit to really integrating this into curriculum and not just have them be one-off kind of lessons, but like they're truly integrated as part of the overall course that they're teaching. That like most skills, right? You focus in and you on one and you get good at practicing it, right? Before you introduce another. And there's a clear way of assessing.
Mark, in Salinas Unified School District, how do teachers use the materials in terms of pacing? Do they typically spend a whole week just focused on this topic, or do they spread things out over a month or a semester? What does the pacing look like in your district?
I think currently right now, those who have familiarized themselves with the curriculum tend to build mini units and and attach them to more of the larger comprehensive units that are in our traditional discipline set, right? So, you know, with our move to really, you know, leverage authentic inquiry and have students be compelled to want to investigate certain questions. From a historical standpoint, we also realize that we have to leverage, like, you know, the current event moments, right? And so that's where I feel like a lot of our history and social studies teachers are, you know, very excited to integrate this curriculum within their units, but also recognizing, because they're new skill sets, right? It's different to source online information than it is to source a historical document. They recognize the need to kind of go in a little deeper and build like mini units to explore the different lessons, right? Whether it be lateral reading or evaluating sources online. And with teachers who are just becoming familiar, you know, I think it's varied, right? I think what we're trying to encourage is, you know, get good at one, right? You know, so maybe start with lateral reading and you know, start teaching students and unlearning ourselves as teachers, you know, to kind of stay on the page and kind of source the page for credibility. You know, like we've been traditionally taught, and start opening up different tabs and start trying to go find out what other people are saying about a particular source, right? And so they might be more comfortable with just kind of one focus, maybe a multi-day lesson, and then trying it out. So I think, again, when it comes to integrating these skills within our courses, it has to be, like most skills, practice and reintroduced in different you know, in different units that are taking a look at different things, but the skill is still applicable broadly, right?
That's great. So newer teachers to the material are picking one piece of it and really digging in and maybe revisiting that over the course of a month or a semester, a year. And then more experienced teachers are taking more of a full set of civic online reasoning skills, doing them in kind of a mini unit with one content focus area, but then continuing to revisit them as they move to different content focus areas. That seems like a great strategy. In your district, how are you about adopting these materials to COVID times?
So it's interesting because I've been in conversations with students before our shutdown and even throughout, in trying to assess what they want to see and how they feel we're meeting their needs in the civic education space. And so you have students openly asking in a lot of different venues for this type of you know, this type of teaching, right? They recognize that, you know, since they have not been allowed to come to school and have these discussions in a brick and mortar classroom, and the explosion of all these things happening in our world, that they need guidance, right? And they want to get better at determining, you know, what to believe, right? On the news, you know, on the web. And so I think that, like, you know, like other things in society, I think COVID has just, you know, kind of underscored, highlighted, exacerbated, what have you, all the kind of issues we saw, you know, going into the pandemic, right? In a way that is challenging, in the sense that, yeah, teachers are still, you know, getting comfortable with engaging students and really trying to figure out what it means to teach, you know, without having that physical, you know, proximity, but also in opportunities, right? So there's this renewed curiosity, and it's a sense of urgency that I think a lot of people are bringing to the moment, right?
So you're hearing demand from your students that they want to learn these skills because they're bombarded with information and perspectives, and they know some of it is disinformation and misinformation, and they're looking for more skills to be able to make sense of that.
Absolutely.
What advice are you giving to new teachers who are planning to use these materials in their classrooms? When people are just planning on getting started with this, do you have any go-to advice for them?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, the exploring the curriculum, it offers a way for you to self-assess, right? Where you're at with regards to um, understanding media and how it works, and you know, helping to unpack some of your biases or your bad habits in terms of consuming online information. So that's the first thing I would suggest is really utilize this as an opportunity to take a look at your own practices, right? In terms of where you get your information, how you assess for credibility, you know, like when you share information and how you engage online. Um, I think the second thing is what I always suggest to educators is that the process of developing and implementing curriculum, whether it's you know, prepackaged or what have you, is always best served in collaboration with others, right? So whether it's, you know, a small group, we have a PLC structure here. So whether it's everyone in your department who's teaching the same class, or whether maybe it's an interdisciplinary type of collaborative setup that you might be able to leverage, taking stock of what other people are doing with the curriculum and how they're experiencing it is always really helpful, right? The last thing that I've been really advocating for with another colleague here who's a teacher librarian is, you know, this renewed relationship with, you know, our curators of information and our you know, assisters of research, right? I know not every district has teacher librarians, but you know, most teachers could probably find a librarian who's willing to help them. And so what we've been doing is kind of presenting both the core curriculum as well as some best practices in terms of you know, database researching, right? And really underscoring the point that there's a difference, right? And if you're really wanting to engage in research in a holistic and kind of systematic way, that you're not just relegated to open web queries, right? You have a whole infrastructure that society has spent a long time building, and now more than ever, it might be useful to leverage that infrastructure before, you know, God forbid it's gone, right? So yeah, partnering with librarians is something that we're stressing here in our district.
In Salinas, what kinds of engagement had you previously had between teachers and librarians? Do students still go to a separate library class? Do librarians come into classrooms that are doing research? Did you find that your existing systems were suitable for doing this collaboration, or have you had to build sort of new times and places for partnerships to make this work?
I think both, right? I think having teacher librarians in our high schools at least, and then having a district that sees value in purchasing licenses for online databases for teachers and students to use. The infrastructure was there. I think what CORE brought to our forefront is that we're not maybe necessarily taking as much advantage of that infrastructure as we can be, um, especially when our clientele is demanding that this is what we want, right, in terms of education. So I think you know, before our collaboration with Sheg, you had your handful of teachers who, if they knew the teacher librarian, you know, they're maybe coming in and bringing their classes into the library, but maybe not necessarily planning with the teacher librarian who is a teacher, right? So who was planning uh, uh, you know, activities to help students understand research, and tying it to the curriculum in collaboration with the subject matter teacher. You had a few teachers who were doing that, but by and large, I would say that not a lot. And so that's one of the things that we want to kind of see increase in its practice across our district. Um, but the infrastructure is there, and we're thankful for that, right?
And it sounds like CORE gives you an opportunity to say, hey, there's some new ideas here. So let's get all the relevant teacher stakeholders together to talk about them. Just as a sort of new curriculum, a new implementation, it's a new reason for people who should be working together all along to renew those connections. That sounds like a terrific idea.
Yeah.
Um, Mark, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think would be really useful for teachers starting that last few bits there was really terrific. We haven't heard that from the other folks that we've interviewed with, and so that's going to be super helpful. But anything else that I haven't asked you that you feel like would be useful for folks?
I think one thing that I wanted to stress is, you know, in piggybacking on that collaboration that teachers should engage in. We're talking about the teaching and the learning, but then that necessarily brings up the conversation around assessing, right? And so how do you know when you're able to do these things, right? And I think the core curriculum, you know, and the approach that Stanford and the history group and Sam Weinberg have always kind of really taken in the field of social studies has been trying to really get at practices that really show whether a student has grown, right, in a certain set of skills. And so, you know, pre and post test kind of practices, but for teachers also, what we've done, what we started to do in the history department is re-examine, especially right now because of time being constrained and not having the same amount of time to interact with students to develop these skills. Essentially, like really essentializing what's the most important, right? And so when the COVID and the distance learning context forced us to have this ongoing conversation, and even in a more urgent way, that's where you had a lot of our teachers, you know, taking stock of everything that's happening in our world right now. Some of them listening to our students and you know hearing what they're saying, and that prompted them to bring the idea that these should be essential skills that are part of our scope and sequence, that are assessed not only like in the classroom, but also possibly at the district level, right? So we're taking a look at that right now in terms of, you know, what would it look like district-wide to embed some of the civic online reasoning practices into our district assessment so that we actually have, you know, some kind of data and measurement to see where we're at, right? And again, very early stages of this, in particular because, you know, it's hard to get a new program implemented in the current environment.
In the midst of a pandemic.
But at the same time, it's almost like, what better time than now, right? So this is something that I think is worth, at least at the classroom level, you know, in the core curriculum offers these kind of assessments kind of built in certain areas, but that's something that as a teacher, you're like, well, how do I know if I'm teaching it right? And how do I know if my students can really do this better, right?
Mark Gomez, curriculum specialist for the Salinas Unified School District. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.